The history books call it a Cold War. That word, cold, has always been the problem. It implies restraint. It implies that the two great powers of the 20th century stood at a distance from each other, staring across a divide they were both too reasonable to cross. It implies control. And that implication has been one of the most dangerous myths the modern world ever chose to believe. What actually happened between roughly 1947 and 1991 was not cold. It was a sustained, continuous, and institutionalized preparation for the end of human civilization, conducted simultaneously by both sides, staffed by hundreds of thousands of people who went to work every morning and did their jobs with the same professionalism they might have applied to running a railroad or managing a bank. The difference was that their job was to be ready, at any moment, to release weapons capable of killing tens of millions of people within the first 30 minutes of a conflict that almost nobody believed they would survive. That is not a Cold War. That is a condition, a permanent state of managed catastrophe, a bureaucracy built around the possibility of annihilation, organized so carefully and so thoroughly that the people inside it sometimes forgot what they were actually managing. What follows is a history of 17 programs, operations, systems, and events that official records barely mention. Some of them were classified for decades. Some remain only partially declassified today. Some were acknowledged only after the people responsible for them had died or retired or moved on to other things. What connects all of them is that they reveal the Cold War not as a geopolitical standoff between two ideologies, but as a machine with its own logic, its own momentum, and its own capacity to make decisions that no individual human being had fully authorized or completely understood. The first program began almost before the Cold War did, and it set the tone for everything that came after. In the final weeks of World War II, as the Soviet army was pushing west through Germany and American forces were moving east, there was a brief window during which the military planners on both sides were already thinking past the war they were fighting. American intelligence had begun compiling detailed assessments of Soviet industrial and military capacity, not for historical purposes, but for targeting purposes. Before the last shots of the Second World War had been fired, the United States Army Air Forces had begun identifying Soviet cities, rail junctions, industrial facilities, and military installations as potential strike targets in a future conflict. This was not fringe thinking. It was institutional planning, conducted by professional officers doing exactly what their profession demanded. The program that would eventually emerge from this early work was called PSYOP, the Single Integrated Operational Plan. But before PSYOP was formalized in 1960, the targeting process went through several iterations, each one revealing something uncomfortable about how nuclear war was being conceptualized by the people responsible for fighting it. One of the earliest formal targeting documents, produced in 1948 and known internally as the Half Moon Plan, assumed that a war with the Soviet Union would begin with a massive American air campaign designed to deliver atomic bombs against Soviet cities and industrial centers. The plan called for dropping approximately 50 atomic bombs on about 20 Soviet cities within the first 30 days of conflict. The stated objective was to retard Soviet advances into Western Europe. But the practical reality of the plan was that it would have killed somewhere between 2 and 3 million Soviet civilians in the first month alone, with additional deaths from radiation, infrastructure collapse, and secondary effects that the planners at the time had only a limited ability to model. What is significant about Half Moon is not its brutality, which was recognized by at least some of the people who worked on it, but its institutional normalcy. This was a planning document. It went through review cycles, it was briefed to senior officials, it was revised and updated. The people who wrote it and approved it were not monsters by any conventional measure. They were military professionals operating within a system that had decided, as a matter of policy, that nuclear weapons would be used offensively in the event of a major war with the Soviet Union. The plan existed not because anyone wanted to kill millions of Soviet civilians. but because the system required a plan, and this was the plan the system produced. This pattern, the system producing plans that no individual fully endorsed but all participants maintained, is the central reality of the Cold War programs that official records barely mention. The second program that deserves examination is one that has been discussed more in recent years but still lacks the public profile its significance demands. It involves the development of automated nuclear release systems, and it began earlier and proceeded further than most accounts suggest. By the late 1950s, American planners had identified a problem that was both technical and philosophical. Nuclear weapons required human authorization to use. But the scenarios most likely to require their use, a sudden Soviet attack, a decapitation strike against American leadership, an overwhelming conventional assault on Western Europe, were also the scenarios most likely to eliminate or incapacitate the people whose authorization was required. If Soviet missiles could destroy Washington within 15 minutes of launch, and the president and the chain of command were in Washington, then the authorization system was designed to fail precisely when it was most needed. The solution that various American programs explored, though never fully implemented in the way the Soviet Union would later implement its own version, was some form of pre-delegated authority. The concept was that under certain defined conditions, lower-level commanders could authorize nuclear release without waiting for explicit presidential approval. The conditions were described in highly classified documents that varied over time, but the basic logic was consistent. If communications with higher authority were lost, if the nature of the attack met certain threshold criteria, if enough time had passed without contact, then authorization could pass downward through the chain of command. What this meant in practice was that the decision to initiate nuclear war was not exclusively located in the hands of the president. It was distributed across a system. Multiple people at multiple levels of command had, under specified conditions, the authority to begin a process that could lead to the release of nuclear weapons. The exact details of how this worked, who had what authority under what conditions, remained among the most tightly held secrets of the American nuclear establishment. Some of it has been partially declassified. Much of it has not. The Soviet Union addressed the same problem with a system that was in some respects more radical and in others more honest about what it was. The system known in the West as Dead Hand, and called Perimeter internally by the Soviets, was a semi-automated command and control system designed to ensure that a Soviet nuclear retaliatory strike could be launched even if the Soviet leadership had been entirely destroyed. The system, which was developed through the 1970s and became operational around 1984, worked through a combination of sensors, communication links, and command logic that could, under certain conditions, automatically transmit launch orders to Soviet missiles without requiring human input at the final stage. The details of how Perimeter actually functioned remained classified in Russia for years after the Cold War ended, and the full technical specifications have never been publicly released. What is known, based on Soviet and Russian sources who discussed it after the Cold War, is that the system was real, that it was operational for an extended period, and that it represented a formal institutional decision to place the possibility of nuclear war partially outside the control of any living human being. The system was not an accident or an oversight. It was a deliberate policy choice made by senior Soviet officials who understood exactly what they were building and who concluded that the logic of deterrence required it. The existence of Perimeter was not publicly acknowledged by Soviet or Russian officials until 1993. For the years during which it was operational, American planners had no confirmed knowledge of its existence, which meant that the strategic calculations underlying American nuclear policy were being made without full information about what the other side's systems could actually do. This was not unusual. Throughout the Cold War, both sides made strategic decisions based on incomplete and frequently incorrect information about what the other side was actually capable of. The gap between what each side believed about the other and what was actually true was often large, and the decisions made to fill that gap frequently made the overall situation more dangerous rather than less. The third program worth examining in detail is one that operated at the intersection of intelligence collection and strategic risk in a way that has still not been fully processed by the public. It involves a series of American reconnaissance operations that deliberately, as a matter of policy, violated Soviet airspace throughout the late 1940s and the 1950s, sending aircraft deep into Soviet territory to photograph military installations, test Soviet radar and air defense responses, and collect electronic intelligence on Soviet communications. These operations were not peripheral or occasional. By the early 1950s, American reconnaissance overflights of Soviet territory were occurring regularly, involving aircraft from multiple services, flying routes that took them over some of the most sensitive military installations in the Soviet Union. The pilots knew the risk. The planners knew the risk. Senior officials who authorized the missions knew the risk. The Soviet Union was a nuclear-armed state, and American aircraft were regularly penetrating its territory without authorization. Some of these missions were shot down, crews were killed, some were captured. The American government, in most cases, denied that the missions had occurred, denied that the aircraft were conducting reconnaissance, and declined to acknowledge the fate of the crews to their families in any honest way. This was not exceptional behavior in the context of the Cold War. It was standard operating procedure. What is less well understood is the effect these overflights had on Soviet military readiness and Soviet strategic thinking. Each time an American aircraft penetrated Soviet airspace, it generated an alert response from Soviet air defenses, triggered communications up the Soviet chain of command, and created pressure on Soviet military commanders to respond. The cumulative effect of years of such incidents was to keep the Soviet military in a state of heightened tension, to normalize the experience of American intrusion, and simultaneously to create exactly the conditions under which a misidentification or a miscalculation could escalate into something far more serious. On at least several documented occasions, Soviet commanders scrambled interceptors in response to radar contacts that turned out not to be American reconnaissance aircraft at all, but were instead weather balloons, flocks of birds, or atmospheric anomalies. The Soviets could not always distinguish between these contacts and actual aircraft. The Americans, running regular reconnaissance missions, had created a threat environment in which Soviet air defense officers had genuine reason to believe that any unidentified radar contact might be hostile. This was not an accidental byproduct of the reconnaissance program. It was, in a certain sense, part of the point. One of the things the overflights were designed to do was to test Soviet radar and air defense response times, which meant that the missions were deliberately generating the conditions that made Soviet miscalculation more likely. The fourth program involves a category of incident that the historical record treats as accidents, but which on examination turns out to be something more systemic. Between 1950 and 1980, the United States military was involved in at least 32 accidents involving nuclear weapons. These are the ones that have been formally acknowledged. The actual number is likely higher. The term used for these incidents within the American military was broken arrow. A broken arrow event was defined as an accident involving a nuclear weapon that created the risk of nuclear war, a nuclear detonation, or radioactive contamination. The definition was deliberately broad, and the incidents that fell within it ranged from aircraft crashes that scattered plutonium across populated areas to accidental drops of armed nuclear bombs that did not detonate only because specific safety mechanisms happened to function correctly. One incident that has received some attention over the years involved a B-52 bomber that broke apart over Goldsboro, North Carolina in January 1961. The aircraft was carrying 2 Mark 39 hydrogen bombs, each with a yield of approximately 3 to 4 megatons. As the aircraft broke apart, both bombs were released. One of them went through a sequence of arming steps that would have culminated in detonation. Investigators later determined that 3 of the 4 safety mechanisms on that weapon had failed. The 4th prevented detonation. A single safety switch, a low-voltage thermal battery switch, was all that stood between a nuclear detonation on American soil and the actual event. A document produced by the Sandia National Laboratories and partially declassified decades later stated explicitly that the bomb had come close to detonating. The yield would have been sufficient to cause catastrophic destruction across a large portion of the eastern seaboard of the United States. This was not a near miss in the sense of a close call between two cars. This was a near miss in the sense of a single mechanical component preventing what would have been the largest man-made explosion in American history on American territory. The government's public response to the Goldsboro incident was limited and carefully worded. The official account emphasized that there had been no nuclear detonation, which was true, and suggested that the weapons had not been in a dangerous state, which was, at minimum, a significant understatement of what the internal investigation had found. The fifth program connects the accidents to a broader institutional pattern. Within the American nuclear establishment, there was a persistent and largely successful effort to manage public knowledge of nuclear risks in a way that prioritized strategic stability over transparency. The logic was internally coherent. If the public understood how frequently nuclear weapons were involved in accidents, how close some of those accidents had come to detonation, and how many of those weapons had been lost, scattered, or compromised in ways that created ongoing radioactive contamination, the political support for nuclear policy might have eroded in ways that planners believed would weaken deterrence. This reasoning was applied not only to accidents, but to a much wider range of activities. The testing program, which detonated hundreds of nuclear devices in Nevada, the Marshall Islands, and other locations, generated health effects in surrounding populations that were studied carefully and disclosed minimally. Workers at nuclear production facilities were exposed to radiation and chemical hazards that were documented internally and withheld from the workers themselves. Communities near nuclear sites were monitored for health effects in studies that were not made available to the communities being studied. None of this was secret in the sense of being known to only a handful of people. Large institutions were involved. Thousands of people had access to the relevant information. What was managed was not the information itself, but its movement, its accessibility, and its public framing. The institutions responsible for nuclear weapons were also the institutions responsible for assessing the risks of nuclear weapons, which created a structural condition in which independent verification of risk assessments was essentially impossible. The sixth program worth examining is one that operated in a domain that seems distant from nuclear weapons, but was deeply connected to the same institutional logic. In the late 1940s and through the 1950s, the Central Intelligence Agency developed and ran a series of programs designed to investigate the possibility that human behavior, memory, and decision-making could be manipulated through chemical, biological, and psychological means. The most extensively documented of these programs is known by the name MKUltra, though that designation covered only a portion of the relevant activities. The program's origins lay in genuine Cold War anxiety. American intelligence had observed what appeared to be successful behavior modification in Soviet and Chinese interrogation of prisoners, including American prisoners of war in Korea, who made confessions and statements that American officials believed could not have been voluntary. The concern that the Soviet Union had developed some form of chemical or psychological method for controlling human behavior was taken seriously at the highest levels of the CIA. The response was to develop American capabilities in the same area. What followed was a research program that ran for approximately 20 years, involved dozens of universities, hospitals, and research institutions, and conducted experiments on human subjects including prisoners, mental patients, drug addicts, and in some cases individuals who had no idea they were participating in experiments at all. The program explored the effects of LSD, barbiturates, mescaline, scopolamine, and other substances on human cognitive function, memory, and resistance to interrogation. It explored hypnosis, sensory deprivation, electroconvulsive therapy, applied in ways far outside any therapeutic norm, and various combinations of psychological stress and pharmacological intervention. The program's director for much of its existence was Richard Helms, who later became Director of Central Intelligence. When congressional investigations began to approach the program in the 1970s, Helms ordered the destruction of MKUltra files. A significant portion of the documentary record was eliminated. What is known today is based primarily on a collection of documents that survived the destruction order because they had been incorrectly filed in a financial record system rather than in the operational files that were targeted for destruction. The destruction of the MKUltra files was itself an act that revealed something important about how these programs functioned. The people running them understood that public knowledge of what they were doing would be politically and legally catastrophic. They also understood that the institutional logic that had created the programs would protect them as long as the programs remained classified. When that protection was threatened, destruction of evidence was considered an acceptable response. This was not a decision made by a rogue actor. It was a decision made by the director of a major American intelligence agency, and it was carried out efficiently. The seventh program involves a different dimension of institutional secrecy, one that touches on how the American government managed information about Soviet capabilities during the critical period of the late 1950s and early 1960s, when the so-called missile gap was a central feature of American political debate. The missile gap was the claim, advanced by Democratic politicians including John Kennedy, by Air Force intelligence assessments, and by various think tanks and analysts, that the Soviet Union had achieved or was on the verge of achieving numerical superiority in intercontinental ballistic missiles. The gap was used to argue for massive increases in American defense spending, for the acceleration of American missile programs, and more broadly, for a posture of urgency and alarm about American security. What American intelligence actually knew, particularly after the U-2 reconnaissance program began producing detailed photographic coverage of Soviet missile installations in the late 1950s, was that the missile gap did not exist in the form being publicly described. Soviet ICBM capabilities were, at the time of the most alarming estimates, far more limited than the alarming estimates suggested. The Soviets had deployed a small number of ICBMs in configurations that were operationally problematic and required significant preparation time before launch. American missile capabilities, though not as large as some had argued for, were substantially greater than Soviet capabilities on almost any measure. This was known, not by everyone, and not with complete certainty, but it was known within the classified intelligence community by 1960, and probably earlier. The Eisenhower administration could not fully refute the missile gap claims without revealing that the United States was systematically overflying Soviet territory, which was itself a significant diplomatic and legal problem. So the administration's public posture was more ambiguous than its private knowledge warranted, which allowed the political debate to continue in terms that did not reflect the actual intelligence picture. The practical effect was that the missile gap, which was partly a genuine intelligence uncertainty and partly a political construct, helped drive American defense spending and strategic posture in ways that made the overall arms race more intense than it would otherwise have been. Soviet leaders, observing the American buildup and the American rhetoric, drew their own conclusions about American intentions, which contributed to their own decisions to accelerate Soviet missile programs. The result was a mutual escalation, driven partly by genuine uncertainty and partly by institutional incentives that rewarded alarming estimates over cautious ones. The eighth program involves the question of what happens when nuclear weapons interact with the ordinary friction of military operations in ways that nobody designed and nobody fully controlled. Throughout the Cold War, American strategic bombers maintained continuous airborne alert, keeping nuclear-armed aircraft in the air around the clock so that they could not be destroyed in a preemptive Soviet attack. This program, known as Chrome Dome, operated continuously from 1961 until 1968, when a series of accidents forced a reconsideration. The Chrome Dome flights sent B-52 bombers loaded with nuclear weapons on routes that took them close to Soviet territory, keeping them airborne for missions that lasted up to 24 hours and required multiple aerial refueling operations. The program was an enormous logistical undertaking, and its purpose was straightforward. It was a visible, continuous demonstration that American nuclear forces could survive a first strike and retaliate. What the program also did was put nuclear weapons into extended contact with the ordinary hazards of aviation, including mechanical failures, crew fatigue, navigation errors, and accidents during the refueling operations that the long missions required. Between 1961 and 1968, several Chrome Dome missions ended in accidents. The Goldsboro incident in 1961 was one of them. In 1968, a B-52 carrying 4 hydrogen bombs crashed near Thule Air Base in Greenland after a fire broke out in the crew compartment. The crash scattered plutonium and other radioactive material across the ice. 3 of the 4 bombs were recovered in damaged but identifiable condition. The 4th was not recovered. It remains, as far as the available record indicates, somewhere in Baffin Bay. The Thule accident ended the continuous airborne alert program. But the program's termination came after years of operation, during which nuclear weapons had been routinely placed in circumstances that created genuine accident risk, and that risk had been accepted as an operational necessity. The accidents that occurred were not considered to be evidence that the program was fundamentally misconceived. They were considered to be unfortunate events that required procedural adjustments. The logic that produced the program remained in place long after the program itself ended. The 9th program worth examining operated in a domain that is rarely associated with nuclear risk, but was deeply implicated in the overall structure of Cold War danger. It involves the management of conventional military operations in and around the Soviet periphery, where the potential for incidents to escalate was constant, and where the institutional responses to those incidents often made escalation more likely rather than less. In the late summer of 1983, a Korean Airlines Boeing 747, flying from New York to Seoul via Anchorage, deviated from its planned course and flew into Soviet airspace over the Kamchatka Peninsula and Sakhalin Island. The deviation was apparently the result of a navigation error involving the aircraft's autopilot system. Soviet air defense forces tracked the aircraft as it flew across Soviet territory. After a period during which Soviet controllers attempted to contact the aircraft and Soviet interceptors attempted to signal it, a Soviet Su-15 fighter shot it down over the Sea of Japan. All 269 people aboard were killed. The Soviet military commanders who ordered and executed the shootdown believed, based on the information available to them, that the aircraft was an American intelligence aircraft conducting a reconnaissance mission. This belief was incorrect. The information available to them was incomplete. The procedures they followed reflected standing orders about how to respond to airspace violations by suspected military aircraft, and the decision to fire was made under time pressure with inadequate information. What is significant about the KAL 007 incident for the purposes of this account is not primarily the tragedy of the civilian deaths, though that was enormous, but what the incident revealed about the structural conditions that made such events possible. Soviet air defense commanders faced a command environment in which authorizing an interceptor to shoot down a suspected military intruder was, under certain conditions, within their standing authority. They did not need to receive explicit authorization from Moscow before firing. The procedures allowed them to act on the basis of their own assessment of the situation. Those procedures existed because the alternative, requiring explicit authorization from senior command for every interception, created a different kind of risk. In a fast-moving air defense situation, the time required to contact higher authority and receive authorization might mean that a hostile aircraft reached its target before it could be stopped. So authority was pre-delegated. And when pre-delegated authority intersects with incomplete information and time pressure, the results are sometimes decisions that would not have been made if more time and more information had been available. The 10th program connects the KAL incident to a broader pattern of near misses involving nuclear forces. In September and October of 1983, the Soviet Union's early warning satellite system detected what appeared to be the launch of American intercontinental ballistic missiles. The detection occurred on multiple occasions within a short period. The officer on duty in the Soviet command center, responsible for monitoring the satellite system, was a lieutenant colonel named Stanislav Petrov. The satellite system indicated a launch of multiple missiles from American territory. The signal met the technical criteria for a genuine detection. The warning was classified as the highest level of certainty the system could produce. Protocol required Petrov to report the detection to his superiors, who would then have initiated the Soviet nuclear response procedures. Petrov did not immediately report the detection as a genuine attack. He reasoned, based on his understanding of American strategic doctrine and the technical characteristics of the detection, that a real American first strike would involve many more missiles than the system was showing, and that the satellite system, which was relatively new, might be experiencing a technical malfunction. He reported the detection as a probable false alarm and did not transmit it up the chain of command as a confirmed attack warning. His assessment was correct. The detections were caused by a rare alignment of sunlight reflections off high-altitude clouds that the satellite's sensors interpreted as missile exhaust plumes. No missiles had been launched, but Petrov did not know this with certainty when he made his decision. He made it based on judgment, experience, and a calculated assessment of probability in a situation where the available information was genuinely ambiguous. The Soviet government did not publicize Petrov's decision. He was initially criticized for failing to follow protocol, though the criticism was later softened. He received no formal commendation. The incident remained classified for years. When it eventually became known in the West, it was treated as a story about individual heroism, which it partly was. But it was also a story about a system that had been designed to make rapid decisions based on automated detection, and that had produced, in this instance, a false alarm of the most dangerous possible kind, at a moment when Soviet-American relations were already extremely tense in the aftermath of the Cal shootdown. The 11th program involves a dimension of the Cold War that is even less discussed than the military operations, partly because it involves what might be called the administrative infrastructure of catastrophe. In the event of nuclear war, both the United States and the Soviet Union had developed extensive plans for what would happen to the government, the military command structure, and the broader apparatus of state power after nuclear strikes had occurred. On the American side, these plans involved an elaborate system of hardened bunkers, alternate command posts, evacuation procedures for senior officials, and communication networks designed to survive nuclear attack. The most famous of these facilities, the bunker under the Greenbrier Resort in West Virginia, was designed to house members of Congress and their staffs in the event of nuclear war. It was built into the hillside beneath the resort's conference center and was maintained in operational readiness for decades. Its existence was officially secret, though it was known to a substantial number of people, and its location could be inferred from the peculiarities of the resort's construction. Less well known are the plans for what the government would actually do after relocating to these facilities. The assumption underlying the continuity of government planning was that a functioning government could be reconstituted after nuclear attacks on major American cities, that this government would have meaningful authority over whatever remained of American society, and that the constitutional order could be maintained or restored in the aftermath of a nuclear exchange. These assumptions were, even by the standards of Cold War planning, optimistic to the point of unreality. Studies conducted within the government during the 1960s and 1970s consistently found that the social and physical infrastructure required to sustain any functioning government would be severely degraded or destroyed by the nuclear exchanges that the planning assumed. The communication systems on which the alternate command posts depended would be disrupted by electromagnetic pulse effects from nuclear detonations. The people who were supposed to staff the alternate facilities would, in many cases, be unable to reach them because the transportation networks would have been destroyed. The planning continued anyway. It continued because the institutional logic of government required plans for every contingency, because the people doing the planning were professionals who understood that their job was to plan, rather than to assess the fundamental viability of the concept, and because stopping the planning would have required someone with authority and inclination to say that the entire premise was wrong. Nobody in a position to make that decision ever said that. The 12th program involves a set of operations that bridge the gap between intelligence collection and military preparation in a way that was systematically more dangerous than either activity in isolation. During the late 1970s and into the 1980s, the United States conducted a series of operations designed to probe Soviet air defenses, test Soviet response times, and assess the capabilities of Soviet radar networks. These operations involved American aircraft and naval vessels approaching Soviet territory in ways that were carefully calculated to stay just outside the boundaries that would have constituted a clear act of war, while being close enough and provocative enough to generate genuine Soviet military responses. The information gathered from these probes was operationally valuable. It told American planners where gaps existed in Soviet radar coverage, how quickly Soviet interceptors could be scrambled, and what electronic signatures Soviet air defense systems produced when activated. What the operations also did was accustom Soviet military commanders to regular American probing operations, which created a baseline against which actual attack scenarios would have to be distinguished. From the Soviet perspective, every American probing operation represented a potential beginning of a real attack that had to be assessed and responded to under time pressure. The distinction between a probing operation and the beginning of a surprise attack was not always obvious in real time, and the procedures for making that distinction under pressure were themselves imperfect. A 1983 NATO exercise called Able Archer 83 brought these dynamics to a point that, based on subsequently declassified documents, came closer to triggering a Soviet nuclear response than has been widely understood. The exercise was designed to simulate the transition from conventional to nuclear warfare in a European conflict. It involved realistic communication procedures, realistic movement of forces, and a realistic exercise of nuclear release authority that, from the perspective of Soviet intelligence monitoring the exercise, was difficult to distinguish from actual preparations for a nuclear strike. Soviet intelligence assessments during the exercise period indicated genuine concern within the Soviet leadership that the exercise might be cover for a real attack. KGB residencies in Western Europe were tasked with monitoring for signs that NATO was actually preparing to strike. Soviet nuclear forces were placed on heightened alert in some areas. The exercise concluded without incident, but the subsequent analysis of Soviet responses, based on intelligence reporting that became available in the years that followed, suggested that the Soviet leadership had taken the possibility of a real NATO attack seriously enough to prepare responses that would themselves have been detectable and potentially misinterpreted by American forces. The 13th program involves a category of covert activity that is discussed in general terms, but rarely examined in operational detail. During the 1980s, the United States conducted a program of psychological operations, economic warfare, and covert support for anti-Soviet movements that was designed to apply pressure to the Soviet system across multiple dimensions simultaneously. The program was coordinated through a series of national security directives signed by President Reagan, and it involved the CIA, the Defense Department, the State Department, and elements of the Treasury Department in an integrated effort to accelerate what American planners believed was an already existing Soviet decline. The covert dimensions of this effort included, among other things, the provision of advanced weapons systems to Afghan Mujahideen fighting Soviet forces in Afghanistan, including Stinger surface-to-air missiles that significantly degraded Soviet air superiority. It included the deliberate introduction of flawed technical data into Soviet procurement channels, with the goal of causing Soviet industrial and military equipment to fail in specified ways at specified times. It included operations designed to disrupt Soviet energy export revenues by manipulating commodity markets and technology export controls. The program also included a dimension that involved coordinated efforts with the Vatican and with Polish trade union leadership to sustain the solidarity movement in Poland, despite Soviet and Polish government efforts to suppress it. The financial and communication support provided through these channels was substantial and was sustained over a period of years through mechanisms designed to obscure the American government's involvement. What is significant about this program for the purposes of this account is not its existence, which has been discussed in various forms, but the degree to which it operated as an integrated system designed to apply stress to the Soviet system across so many dimensions that the Soviet leadership would find it difficult to distinguish deliberate American pressure from the genuine internal contradictions of the Soviet economic and political model. This was, in a meaningful sense, a form of warfare conducted below the threshold of conventional military engagement, and it was conducted with an intensity and a coordination that its public characterizations have not fully conveyed. The 14th program involves the ocean, which was a primary theater of Cold War operations in ways that the public record has never fully reflected. Throughout the Cold War, American and Soviet submarines operated in close proximity to each other in ways that created continuous risk of collision, escalation, and misinterpretation. American attack submarines regularly tracked Soviet ballistic missile submarines, following them closely enough to maintain targeting solutions. Soviet submarines conducted similar operations against American vessels. The submarine operations were governed by a set of rules and understandings that were never formally codified in any treaty or agreement. Both sides understood that there were limits to what the other would tolerate, but those limits were tested regularly, and the process of testing them created incidents that could have escalated, but generally did not. There were collisions. American and Soviet submarines collided on multiple occasions during the Cold War, and in several cases the collisions were serious enough to cause significant damage. The incidents were handled quietly. Neither side had an interest in publicizing them, because publicizing them would have required acknowledging the proximity at which the submarine operations were conducted, which would in turn have revealed operational details that both sides preferred to keep classified. What the submarine operations reveal, beyond the specific incidents, is the degree to which the Cold War was conducted through continuous physical contact between the military forces of the two sides, in ways that were invisible to the public and that created ongoing risk of accidents and escalation. The ocean was not a buffer zone between the two sides. It was an operational environment in which American and Soviet military forces interacted regularly, at close range, in conditions that rewarded aggression and punished caution. One documented incident from the early 1980s involved an American submarine that became entangled with a Soviet submarine during a tracking operation, resulting in a collision that damaged both vessels. The American submarine returned to port for repairs. The incident was not publicly acknowledged by either government. The crews of both vessels were briefed on the confidential nature of what had occurred, and the incident was entered into classified records that would not become available to researchers for decades. The 15th program involves something that might be called the sociology of nuclear readiness, the question of what it does to human beings to work in systems designed for catastrophic violence, and how those human effects interacted with the operational systems in which those people were embedded. By the early 1970s, American officials responsible for oversight of nuclear forces had identified a pattern of behavior among personnel serving in missile launch facilities that was concerning enough to require formal study. The pattern included unauthorized modifications to safety procedures, evidence of substance abuse among personnel with access to nuclear weapons, and in some cases psychological assessments suggesting that individuals with nuclear launch authority were experiencing significant mental health difficulties. A study conducted in the early 1970s found that a substantial percentage of personnel in nuclear roles were flagged for various performance or behavioral concerns in any given year. The percentage varied by service and facility, but the consistent finding was that maintaining a large force of human beings in a state of continuous readiness to launch nuclear weapons on short notice created psychological stresses that manifested in behavior patterns that were inconsistent with the reliability requirements of the systems those personnel were operating. The response to these findings was not to reconsider the operational model. It was to develop better screening procedures, better monitoring systems, and better intervention protocols for individuals who showed signs of unreliability. The underlying logic of the system, that human beings would be kept in readiness to execute nuclear launch procedures on short notice, was not questioned. The question was only how to manage the human element more effectively within that logic. This pattern was not unique to the United States. Soviet documentation on the psychological condition of nuclear forces personnel from the Cold War period is much more limited. But what has become available through Russian archives and through accounts of former Soviet military personnel suggests that similar problems existed and were addressed with similar institutional logic. The 16th program involves a category of incident that has received some public attention, but whose systemic implications have not been fully examined. At several points during the Cold War, American and Soviet leaders came close to nuclear war, not because of strategic miscalculation at the highest levels, but because of failures in the early warning and command systems that were supposed to provide the information on which decisions were based. One such incident occurred on November 9, 1979, when the North American Aerospace Defense Command, known as NORAD, received warning of a massive Soviet missile attack against the United States. The warning system showed, with high confidence indicators, that hundreds of Soviet missiles had been launched and were on their way to targets in North America. American forces were placed on alert. Preliminary notifications were sent to senior officials. The process that would have led to presidential authorization for nuclear retaliation was initiated. The warning was false. It had been generated by a training tape that someone had accidentally loaded into the operational warning system rather than the training system. The tape simulated a Soviet missile attack with sufficient technical accuracy to pass through the initial filters that were supposed to distinguish real from simulated alerts. The incident lasted approximately 6 minutes before it was identified as a false alarm. 6 minutes was, by the standards of the warning systems then in place, a significant amount of time. The timeline from Soviet missile launch to detonation on American soil was approximately 30 minutes for ICBMs and substantially less for submarine-launched missiles deployed close to American shores. A 6-minute false alarm that consumed 6 minutes of decision time was, therefore, not a trivial event. The investigation that followed found the technical failure that had caused the incident. It also found that the procedures for distinguishing genuine alerts from false alarms had significant weaknesses that the incident had exposed. Procedural modifications were made. The fundamental architecture of the system was not changed. In June 1980, a similar incident occurred when NORAD again received warning of a Soviet missile attack. This incident was caused by a defective integrated circuit chip, a component costing less than $1 that was causing random numbers to appear in a portion of the display system in a way that simulated missile launch data. The false warning again triggered the alert procedures before it was identified as a malfunction. 2 significant false alarms within 7 months revealed that the early warning system on which American nuclear decision-making depended was vulnerable to technical failures of a kind that the system's designers had not adequately anticipated. The response was incremental improvement rather than fundamental redesign. The 17th program, and the one that in some respects brings all the others into focus, involves the question of what the Cold War actually was at its deepest level, below the strategic doctrines and the weapons programs and the intelligence operations. What emerges from examining the specific programs and incidents described here is that the Cold War was, at its core, a competition between 2 enormous bureaucratic systems, each of which had developed its own internal logic, its own institutional incentives, and its own momentum. The people inside those systems, from the most senior officials to the lowest-ranking personnel, were shaped by the systems in ways that made their individual choices comprehensible within the system's logic, even when those choices were, from an external perspective, profoundly irrational. The nuclear targeting plans that scheduled the deaths of tens of millions of people were produced by professional military planners doing their jobs. The human experiments conducted under MKUltra were conducted by researchers operating within institutional frameworks that defined their work as legitimate. The reconnaissance overflights that regularly violated Soviet sovereignty were authorized by officials who believed they were protecting American security. The early warning systems that produced false alarms of Soviet attacks were designed by engineers who understood the limits of their technology and worked within constraints they could not control. What all of these programs share is that they were produced by institutions that had developed the capacity to pursue their objectives in ways that were largely independent of any individual's intentions. The Cold War was not a war that any individual chose or any individual could stop. It was a condition maintained by systems that had their own logic and their own requirements, and that produced outcomes which the people inside them could influence but never fully control. The evidence for this claim is available in the specific incidents described here and in the many others that the historical record, even in its partially declassified state, contains. The Goldsboro bomb that came within a single switch of detonating on American soil. The Petrov incident, in which a Soviet officer's individual judgment prevented a false alarm from becoming a catastrophe. The Able Archer exercise that convinced Soviet intelligence that NATO was preparing an actual nuclear strike. The submarine collisions that were settled quietly because neither side wanted to acknowledge the proximity at which their forces operated. The false alarms that triggered alert procedures and then dissipated without the senior officials who needed to make decisions ever having to make them. Each of these incidents was resolved without catastrophe, but the resolution was not the result of the systems functioning as designed. In most cases, the resolution was the result of individual judgment operating outside or at the margins of the prescribed procedures, or of fortunate coincidences of timing, or of technical failures that happened to produce less dangerous outcomes than the range of possible failures would have allowed. The Cold War ended in 1991 with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The end came faster than almost anyone had predicted, through a combination of internal Soviet economic failure, political transformation, and the exhaustion of a system that had been under unsustainable stress for decades. The American systems that had developed in response to the Soviet threat did not end with the Soviet Union. The weapons remained. The command systems remained. The institutional logic that had produced the targeting plans, the reconnaissance operations, the early warning networks, and the continuity of government bunkers remained. The treaties that followed reduced the numbers of weapons on both sides, substantially in some categories, but did not eliminate the fundamental architecture of nuclear deterrence that the Cold War had built. The people who had staffed the systems retired or moved on to other roles. The institutions that had built and operated the systems reconstituted themselves around new threat assessments and new strategic frameworks. The weapons that had been aimed at Soviet cities were retargeted or placed in lower states of readiness, but they were not destroyed. The knowledge that had produced them persisted in the engineers and scientists who had built them and in the technical documentation that described how to build more. The Cold War ended without resolving the systems that sustained it, and those systems persist in modified form to this day.